What happens when the most powerful man on earth has no limits? Emperor Caligula answered that question in ways that still shock historians. He turned his palace into a brothel. He stole brides on their wedding nights. He invited goddesses to his bed. What you're about to watch isn't an exaggeration. These are the 15 most horrifying, intimate acts of Rome's most twisted emperor. The 4 friends of all the women who shared Caligula's bed, only one truly captured his twisted heart: Milonia Caesonia. She wasn't young. She wasn't particularly beautiful. She'd already been married and had 3 daughters by another man. But something about her wildness, her reckless abandon, drove the emperor mad with obsession. And Caligula had a peculiar way of showing his love. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, the emperor would parade Caesonia before his troops, dressed in a military cloak, helmet, and shield, riding alongside him like some warrior queen. But that wasn't enough for a man whose appetites knew no limits. In private gatherings with his closest friends, Caligula would strip his empress completely naked and display her before them. Sometimes she held their infant daughter while standing exposed before the leering eyes of Rome's elite. It was his way of boasting, showing off his prized possession, like a man might display a fine horse or a rare jewel. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Suetonius tells us that while kissing Caesonia's neck, Caligula would whisper, "Off comes this beautiful head whenever I give the word." When assassins finally came for Caligula in 41 AD, they didn't spare Caesonia. She was cut down alongside her husband, and their infant daughter's head was dashed against a wall. Perhaps, in the end, Caligula's twisted promise came true. But stealing your own wife's dignity was just the beginning. What happens when the emperor decides that other men's wives belong to him too in their very wedding night? Stealing brides on their wedding night. Rome, 37 AD. A prestigious wedding unites Livia Orestilla and Gaius Calpurnius Piso, both prominent figures in Roman society. The atmosphere is vibrant, wine flowing, guests laughing, and the couple celebrated as a symbol of status and promise. Then the emperor walks in. Caligula hadn't been invited as a guest of honor. He'd come as a predator. According to Suetonius, the young emperor watched the ceremony with hungry eyes, fixated on the beautiful bride. And then, without warning, he made his move. "Don't take liberties with my wife," Caligula announced to the stunned groom. Before anyone could react, he ordered his guards to seize Livia and carry her directly to his palace. The wedding feast continued without a bride. The groom stood humiliated before all of Roman high society. The next morning, Caligula issued a public proclamation boasting that he had acquired a wife in the manner of Romulus and Augustus, both legendary figures known for stealing women from other men. He was comparing himself to the founders of Rome itself. But here's the cruelest twist. Within days, Caligula grew bored with Livia and divorced her. Yet he also forbade her from ever returning to Pisa. 2 years later, he banished them both on charges of adultery for being together, the very union he had interrupted. Publicly raiding senators' wives' bedroom performance, the dinner invitations from Emperor Caligula were impossible to refuse and impossible to survive with your dignity intact. Roman senators knew the drill. When summoned to the imperial banquets, they were required to bring their wives. It wasn't optional. And what happened next followed a sickening pattern that Suetonius documented in disturbing detail. Caligula would have the wives paraded before him during dinner, inspecting them like livestock at a market. He'd comment openly on their physical attributes, their figures, their faces, their flaws, while their husbands sat frozen, unable to protest. Then came the selection. Whichever woman caught the emperor's eye would be led away to his private chambers. The husband remained at the table, surrounded by other guests, forced to continue eating and drinking as if nothing were happening. But the true humiliation came when Caligula returned, flushed and disheveled. He would rejoin the banquet and proceed to give a detailed review of the woman's performance in bed right in front of her husband. He'd critique her passion, her technique, her enthusiasm. Too eager, too cold, disappointing, surprisingly skilled. The husband could say nothing. The wife could say nothing. The other guests stared at their plates. This wasn't about lust. Caligula never lacked options. It was about dominance, about shattering Rome's strongest men by violating what mattered most to them, then making them stand quietly while he dictated their fate. Turning the imperial palace into a brothel, Caligula had expensive tastes and an empty treasury. His predecessor, Tiberius, had left him a fortune, 2.7 billion sesterces by some accounts, and the young emperor burned through it in a single year on games, spectacles, and personal extravagance. He needed money, and in his twisted mind, he found the perfect solution. According to Suetonius, Caligula converted an entire wing of the imperial palace into a functioning brothel. But this wasn't staffed by common prostitutes from Rome's streets. No, that would be far too ordinary for an emperor who fancied himself a living god. Instead, Caligula forced the wives and daughters of Roman senators and noblemen to serve as the workers. Think about what this meant. The most powerful families in Rome, the men who controlled armies, governed provinces, shaped laws, had to watch as their wives and daughters were compelled to sell themselves in the emperor's palace. Caligula himself reportedly stood at the door, collecting the fees from citizens eager to sample their betters. It was the ultimate inversion of Roman social order. The aristocracy forced into the role of common prostitutes, the emperor playing the role of a pimp, and the message was unmistakable. Your status, your honor, your family, none of it matters. Everything belongs to me.
Prostituting his own sisters to his male lovers. When Caligula became emperor, he showered his sisters with unprecedented honors. Their names were included in official oaths. Their faces appeared on imperial coins. They were granted privileges, usually reserved for the Vestal virgins. It seemed like genuine devotion. But Caligula's love for his sisters had a darkness that horrified even Rome. Suetonius tells us that Agrippina and Livilla suffered a fate no Roman noblewoman could imagine. The emperor prostituted them to his catamites, his young male lovers. Caligula pimped out his own sisters to the men he kept for his own pleasure. This wasn't about money or political strategy. This was pure degradation, a way of asserting total dominance over every person in his orbit, including his own blood. The women who should have been the most protected people in Rome became playthings to be passed around at the emperor's command. Eventually, Agrippina and Livilla were implicated in a conspiracy against their brother, whether real or fabricated, and Caligula exiled them to the remote Pontine Islands. Agrippina would survive to become the mother of Emperor Nero. She had learned well from her brother about the uses of cruelty and power.
The floating pleasure palaces of Lake Nemi, 19 miles south of Rome, lies a small volcanic lake called Nemi, barely 3.5 miles around. The Romans called it Diana's mirror, for the way moonlight reflected on its sacred waters. No ship was supposed to sail on this holy lake. Caligula didn't care about sacred. He ordered the construction of 2 massive barges floating palaces, unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The larger ship stretched 240 feet long and 79 feet wide. That's roughly the length of an Airbus A380 passenger jet. On a lake, you could walk around in an hour. These weren't vessels for sailing. They were too heavy to move on their own, anchored to the shore by chains and connected by bridges to land. They were floating pleasure palaces, and ancient sources hint at what happened aboard them. Marble mosaic floors, walls inlaid with ivory, hot and cold running water for baths, bronze sculptures, rotating platforms, possibly for banquets, possibly for performances, possibly for things historians prefer not to describe in detail. Suetonius and other writers speak of orgies, murder, cruelty, and excess taking place on these barges. Away from Rome, surrounded by water, Caligula could indulge his darkest appetites without restraint. The ships survived Caligula's assassination by only days. His successors had them weighted with stones and sunk to the lake bottom in an attempt to literally bury his legacy. They lay there for nearly 1,900 years until Mussolini drained the lake in 1929 to recover them. The ships were housed in a museum until 1944, when retreating Nazi soldiers set them ablaze. Threatening to torture his wife to understand his love here is perhaps the most disturbing glimpse into Caligula's psychology, a moment that reveals how completely twisted his understanding of love and intimacy had become. Caesonia was, by all accounts, the wife Caligula actually cared about times, unlike the brides he stole and discarded within days, unlike the noble women he humiliated and forgot. Caesonia held his attention. He was, in his own deranged way, faithful to her. But Caligula couldn't understand his own feelings. Why did this woman, not young, not especially beautiful, already a mother by another man, captivate him so completely? The question gnawed at him. And so, according to Suetonius, the emperor would turn to Caesonia and say, "I would resort to torture if necessary, to find out from my dear Caesonia why I love her so passionately." Pause on that sentence. This was a man so disconnected from normal human emotion that he believed the answer to love might be extracted through pain, that the mystery of his own heart could be solved by applying instruments of torment to the woman who inspired those feelings. Was it a joke? A dark bit of imperial humor, perhaps? But Roman historians didn't treat it that way. They recorded it as evidence of a man for whom violence and affection had become impossibly intertwined. Every kiss came with a reminder of danger. Every moment of tenderness carried an undercurrent of threat. For Caesonia, being loved by Caligula must have been a form of torture, all its own, never knowing when his passion might turn to genuine cruelty. Auctioning gladiators, two lustful noblewomen, Caligula had a gift for finding new ways to humiliate Rome's elite and new ways to fill his constantly emptying treasury. His gladiator auctions accomplished both with devastating efficiency. The gladiators of Rome were more than fighters. They were celebrities, muscular, dangerous, famous. Women throughout the empire fantasized about them. Graffiti found in Pompeii speaks to their sex appeal. Celadus, the Thracian, makes the girls swoon. These men were forbidden fruit, slaves who could kill in the arena but belonged to their owners like property. Caligula saw an opportunity. According to Suetonius, the emperor began holding private auctions where wealthy noblewomen could bid for the company of famous gladiators. The bidding wars became legendary. Women who had spent their lives maintaining reputations of virtue and modesty found themselves competing publicly for knights with blood-soaked arena fighters, and Caligula rigged the game. He would plant agents in the crowd to drive up prices, exploiting the women's desires until they bid astronomical sums. One former praetor, attending on behalf of someone else, nodded off during the proceedings. Caligula interpreted each sleepy head bob as a bid. The man woke up having purchased 13 gladiators for 9 million sesterces of fortune he never intended to spend. But the true victims were the noble women themselves. Their secret lusts, their private fantasies, were dragged into public auctions where the emperor himself served as auctioneer. Every bid was an admission of desire. Every purchase was a scandal waiting to happen. Forbidding husbands from ever touching their wives again, taking another man's wife, was power. But what Caligula did next was something crueler. He made sure those wives could never return to their husbands, even after he was finished with them. According to Roman historians, when Caligula slept with a senator's wife, he didn't simply use her and send her home. He issued formal divorce proceedings in the husband's name, without the husband's consent. The woman was now legally divorced. The marriage was over, and Caligula would then prohibit her from ever resuming intimate relations with her former husband. First, the husband was forced to watch his wife be taken. Then he was publicly divorced from her against his will. And finally, he was forbidden from ever being with her again, even though Caligula himself had already moved on to his next conquest. The wife existed in a kind of limbo, no longer married, not remarried to the emperor, simply claimed and discarded, like property that had been used and marked. For the husbands, this was emasculation taken to its logical extreme. Roman men defined themselves partly through their roles as heads of households, protectors of their families. Caligula stripped that away completely, not just for one night, but permanently. Some of these couples reportedly found ways to be together secretly, risking death if discovered. The emperor had spies everywhere, and defying his orders meant defying a god. Marrying and discarding for wives in 4 years, Caligula's approach to marriage was less about partnership and more about possession and disposal. In his brief 29 years of life, the emperor went through 4 wives with a speed that scandalized even Rome's jaded aristocracy. Each marriage revealed something darker about his relationship with intimacy. His first wife, Caligula, died in childbirth in 34 A, did the one marriage that ended through tragedy rather than cruelty. She was the daughter of a noble family, chosen for political advantage. Caligula was barely 22 when she died, taking their unborn child with her. His second wife came and went within days of scandal we've already witnessed, but it established a pattern. His third wife, Lalia Paulina, caught his eye for an unusual reason. Her grandmother had been famously beautiful. That was enough. Caligula summoned Lalia from the provinces where she lived with her husband, Memmius Regulus, a former consul commanding armies. The emperor forced her to divorce Memmius immediately and married her himself. When Lalia failed to produce an heir quickly enough, Caligula's interest evaporated. He divorced her, but not before issuing a decree that would follow her for life. Finally came Melonia Caesonia, his fourth and final wife. Pregnant before they married, she gave birth to their daughter on their wedding day. Unlike the others, she held his attention until the very end, for marriages in 4 years. Women summoned, claimed, used, and discarded according to imperial whim. To Caligula, a wife was never a partner, she was property with an expiration date. Having intimate affairs with hostage princes, Rome's power extended across the known world, and one way it maintained control over distant kingdoms was through hostages. Sons of foreign kings were sent to Rome as guarantees of their fathers. Loyalty living insurance policies, dressed in royal clothing. These young princes were supposed to be treated with dignity. They lived in the imperial household, received Roman educations, and learned Roman ways. When they eventually returned home to rule their own kingdoms, they would be allies of Rome. Caligula had other plans for them. According to Suetonius and other historians, the emperor engaged in sexual relations with multiple hostage princes' young men, who had no power to refuse the ruler who held their lives in his hands. The ancient sources describe these encounters bluntly, noting that Caligula practiced mutual pollution with various hostages kept in Rome. Think about the power dynamic. These were princes' royalty in their own lands, reduced to sexual playthings for a Roman emperor. They couldn't say no. Their family's safety, their kingdom's futures, their own lives depended on keeping Caligula happy. If they returned home and spoke of what happened, they risked Roman retaliation. If they resisted in the moment, they risked immediate death. They were trapped in the most intimate way possible. For Caligula, this was the ultimate expression of imperial dominance. He wasn't just conquering foreign lands through military force, he was conquering foreign royalty through their own bodies. The princes who eventually returned to their kingdoms carried with them not just Roman education, but Roman violation, and they ruled their people knowing they had been utterly powerless before Rome's mad emperor, hosting mass orgies with strangers from all classes. When Caligula threw a party, Rome trembled. According to multiple ancient sources, the emperor would periodically transform his marble-floored villas into something unprecedented. Mass gatherings, where the normal rules of Roman society simply ceased to exist. Hundreds of people would be summoned, not just the aristocracy, but strangers from all walks of life, merchants, freedmen, perhaps even slaves. The rigid class system that defined every aspect of Roman existence was temporarily suspended within the emperor's walls. Food and wine flowed without limit, and then the clothing came off. These weren't private affairs between consenting adults. They were orchestrated spectacles of imperial power, where Caligula presided over the dissolution of every social boundary. A senator's wife might find herself next to a common tradesman. The hierarchies that Romans spent their entire lives navigating gone by imperial command. For Caligula, this served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that he alone could suspend the rules of civilization. It humiliated the aristocracy by forcing them to mingle intimately with their social inferiors. And it provided entertainment for an emperor whose appetites could never be satisfied by ordinary pleasures. The morning after must have been extraordinary. Hundreds of Rome's citizens gathering their scattered clothing, avoiding each other's eyes, returning to a society where they would pretend none of it had happened. But everyone knew, everyone remembered, and everyone understood that the emperor who could command such gatherings could command anything. The incestuous obsession with Sister Drusilla. Her name was Julia Drusilla, and she was the center of Caligula's universe. Of his three sisters, Drusilla was unquestionably the favorite, but favorite doesn't begin to capture the intensity of what ancient sources describe. According to Suetonius, Caligula was caught having relations with her as a teenager by their grandmother Antonia. He treated her openly as his wife while she was still legally married to another man. He named her his unprecedented for a woman in Rome. Whether their relationship was truly incestuous or merely extraordinarily close has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue the accusations were propaganda invented by Caligula's enemies. But the emperor's behavior after Drusilla's death in 38 AD suggests something beyond normal sibling grief. Caligula went mad. He refused to let anyone remove her body. He declared a period of public mourning so extreme that it became a capital offense to laugh, bathe, or dine with family anywhere in Rome. He fled the city, refusing to cut his hair or shave his beard. When he finally returned, he forced the Senate to deify Drusilla, making her the first Roman woman ever to be declared a goddess by imperial decree. She was given the name Panthea, meaning all-goddess. Temples were built in her honor. Her statue was placed alongside Venus herself. Anyone who failed to mourn her sufficiently risked death. Caligula named his only daughter, Julia Drusilla, after his dead sister. He carried the infant to every goddess statue in Rome, laying her in the lap of Minerva and praying for her protection. Whatever their relationship truly was, Drusilla's death broke something in Caligula that was never repaired. The cruelty that followed the escalating madness, the wanton murders can almost be traced to that moment when the one person he truly loved was taken from him, declaring himself a living god. And so we arrive at Caligula's ultimate transgressions, the act that encompassed all others, that explained his cruelty, justified his depravity, and ultimately sealed his doom. He declared himself a god, not after death, as was traditional for emperors, not symbolically as a representative of divine power. Caligula demanded to be worshipped as a living deity while he still drew breath equal to Jupiter himself. He ordered a bridge built between his palace and the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill so he could visit the king of gods for private conversations. He appeared in public dressed as various deities, Jupiter, Neptune, Venus, Mercury, wearing divine attributes and expecting appropriate reverence. But Caligula didn't simply want worship, he wanted intimacy with the divine. Suetonius tells us that he would stand beside Jupiter's statue and ask visitors which of them was greater, a test that, as we've seen, could prove fatal. He reportedly invited the moon goddess to his bed, frustrated that she refused his advances. When he wasn't impersonating gods, he was threatening them. Ancient sources describe Caligula picking fights with Jupiter during his nighttime delusions, challenging the king of the gods to combat. But the most dangerous aspect of his divine pretensions was political. Caligula ordered his statue placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a provocation that nearly triggered a massive Jewish revolt. He forced senators, Rome's most powerful men, to prostrate themselves and worship him as a god while he was alive. This was the intimacy that mattered most to Caligula, not with women, not with his sisters, not with his suffering victims, but with divinity itself. He wanted to be loved, feared, and worshipped, not as an emperor, but as a god. On January 24th, 41 AD, the Praetorian Guard answered his prayers in their own way. They stabbed him more than 30 times in a tunnel beneath his palace, proving conclusively that whatever Caligula believed himself to be, his blood was as mortal as anyone's. He was 29 years old. He had reigned for less than 4 years. But in that brief time, he had demonstrated exactly what happens when a man with absolute power convinces himself that he answers to no one, not to law, not to morality, not to the gods themselves. Rome never forgot. Neither should we. If this video fascinated you, subscribe, because history's darkest chapters are still waiting to be told.